I've obviously been thinking a lot over last little while, about, and in particular, the great privilege I had of being involved with Augustine College, which looks as though we don't know, but we had absolutely nobody wanting to come and take the course this year. So you can't run a college that way, especially since the way it started, nobody needed any money because all the people who were the teachers to begin with a couple of exceptions, were professors at the university. We had an income, and we could spare a couple of hours a week to teach, which is what we did. We had a wonderful physician who did the administrative work that was required. He and his wife, they worked incredibly hard for very little thanks, but they'll have a reward in heaven, which will be considerable. But Wayne would invite us to his house for breakfast, and then he'd tell us what honorarium we were going to get at the end of the term, a few $100s. But the course that was taught was incredible. And I mean, 300 or so students who went through in 25 years. Yeah, I hear from quite a few of them quite often. It was the high point of their education. It gave them a perspective that they couldn't get any other way. Augustine himself said, credo ut intelligam, which being interpreted means, I believe in order to understand. The modern teacher thinks you understand in order to believe. They teach to change your beliefs. Christians don't. Christians say what we believe makes it possible to think this way. Doing an experiment is an act of faith. And it would never have come out of a pagan world or a fatalistic world like Islam or the Eastern religions. Only the Judeo-Christian approach to the world gives you reason to do experiments, because we're told to be stewards of nature. But how do we do that if we don't understand it? What we do understand is that God is reliable, so maybe despite the apparent chaos on the surface of life, there's some order underneath. And so we started doing inductive reasoning. Now, the people who understand the issues, the bioethicists to some degree, and the philosophers, they don't like the idea of induction because they know it will take them back to faith. So they teach the students now that we do science by the hypothetico-deductive system. We say, wouldn't it be wonderful if the world was like this? Let's assume it is and see what happens. That's parasitic, because that would be an absolutely unthinkable idea if you were a pagan. That's why they never did it. So the way we think has to be rooted much more deeply than it is at the moment. Basically, what we've done is cut off the top level of understanding. You can find an earlier podcast if you're interested in doing this yourself, but essentially reductionism, which is technically what experimental science is, emerged out of the late 13th century to early 14th century. And the first experiments were done in Merton College, Oxford, in a systematic way. They drew a graph without knowing what they were doing. That's what happens in science. And then you sit back and say, oh my goodness, what's happened? Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. What's that all about? This is not something that logically flows out. That's not the way it works. Time and time again, it's a moment of insight. Einstein, we're talking with a friend. He'd been working away in his patent office, and the friend made a comment, and Einstein said, I have to go, sorry. And he ran away to go back to his office. That was what became relativity. That moment of insight which came out of a sentence. Roger Penrose describes on one occasion crossing the high street in Oxford to go to a meeting on the other side, and he was standing on the yellow line in the middle of the road when suddenly he saw the solution to what he'd been thinking about all morning. He turned around, went back, didn't go to the committee. It crystallized a moment. You take notice of something that you could easily have dismissed. I have little examples of that in my own experience. So And my good friend Philip Hilton has spent 25 years pursuing something that he knew had to exist. Everybody laughed at him, but he's found it. He's only got a few nanograms so far, but it's a new hormone, basically, which will turn out to be very important, I think, in the regulation of the biggest energy-consuming machine in the body, the sodium pump. So you can't predict those things. You can't have a committee say this is what you do. And our education needs to have lots of those examples. If you are involved in teaching science and you haven't read Leslie Newbigin's little book, Foolishness to the Greeks, read it. It'll take you back to Polanyi, who started the process. But as human beings, we have what Polanyi and Newbigin called tacit knowledge. That's things that you know without knowing how you know them, but you're certain that you know them. Now, it's not intuition in the same way. It's got some shared characteristics, but intuition is driven by you, whereas tacit knowledge is you realizing you're in a world that has more meaning than you realized, and it is leading you on. That's what real science does. And when you can teach that to children in those early years, you don't teach them any big stuff. You just teach them that they soak everything up, but they love narrative. They're defined by it. My favorite example of this is the annual Faraday lecture in London at Christmas for children. Because Michael Faraday was a deeply committed Christian who had no formal education, never went to high school. Yet he has an international unit named after him. He wasn't good at mathematics because he never had any training in that area, but he was a brilliant experimental scientist. And he knew he would stop a committee meeting to go to a prayer meeting. He knew which was the more important. And a couple of years ago, the Christmas lecture describes one day in the life of Michael Faraday, the day he invented the electric motor, because he saw things. He saw something which no other physicist had seen. It was there to be seen, but he, not being driven by a mathematical presupposition, simply looked and saw that a wire going through a magnetic field was trying to move. And by the end of the day, he had showed that it could move in what we would now call an electric motor. And the man who did, an American, does a wonderful story. So the Faraday lecture, if you teach physics to children, or even if you don't, if you're teaching science to children, showing them that lecture and stopping and talking about it as you go along, they'll never forget that. I mean, I look back over my now 85 years of existence and try to think about the things that fit in that category. There aren't many. You look back at moments of absolutely vital insights coming from who knows where. Christians think they know where it comes from, and it's a better explanation than any other. So, Tom Sowell, as always, I don't know what Tom Sowell really believes. I think he's got to be at some level at least open to Christianity, but I don't know. But I came this week across a lovely sentence that only he could write, I think. It's this: each new generation born is in effect an invasion of barbarians who must be civilized before it is too late. He understands that education is a process of civilization. He describes it himself in his writings. How one woman in particular played a major role in educating the young and rebellious Tom Sowell on his way to being briefly a Marxist, but too intelligent to stay there. And most of the academic world tries to pretend that Tom Sowell doesn't exist. You certainly don't take him down. Hoover Institute. You can find, if you want to listen to him, and he's lovely to listen to. Listen to Peter Robinson interview him on Uncommon Knowledge, which is a website that He's part of the Hoover Institute. So, how do we educate? I mean, education in the Western world is a gift from Christianity, uh, supplemented by Judaism later on. But the move to modern education, ultimately, I mean, it took centuries, is described by Alistair MacIntyre as the gift that Benedict gave. We are waiting for a doubtless new St. Benedict. Why? Well, what Benedict did was save the intellectual riches of the Western world, uh, both Greek and Roman, by starting monasteries. And I mean, the barbarians pushed it right back to the Celtic rim, but it came back over time. Long, slow process. God is never in a hurry. And that history is worth telling. Narrative and history is important. When you forget your history, which the Jews did multiple times, it was always a disaster. I mean, Exodus begins, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. That's the problem. When your leaders don't understand where the ideas that made you successful came from, it's going to take centuries to recover. We are facing at the moment, if we don't recover that fundamental base, it's going to take centuries to get back to where we were when I was a child. My grandchildren tell me I'm too miserable about this. I hope they're right, but I don't think I am, because I think it's only by talking about it that we can possibly have some redemption. We certainly need it. There's no question. You can ask any university student who's just finished a degree, tell me, what have you learned in the past 4 years that's of permanent significance to you? Tell me about a lecture that you will never forget. Most of them have never had any such experience. They memorize and they dump. That's what happens when the bureaucratic mindset takes over. They want us to be measurable so that they can tell us what to do. But all the important things are not measurable, especially the ones that are turning points in your education. The aha moments. They have no respect for that. They're destroying medicine because in order to run medicine bureaucratically, you have to assume that doctors are like widgets. They're all the same. But they're not. They never were and never will be. Because medicine is not primarily about curing your diseases. It's much more than that. Most important of all, let's face it, read Bad Medicine, the history of medicine. I've forgotten the name of the guy. But for centuries, doctors were honoured. But they were honoured not because they could cure you. They couldn't. There were a few amazing things people did, like cutting a stone out of the bladder in about 30 seconds without an anaesthetic, but they could do it. And a caesarean section was not far off that earlier. We did lots of things before anaesthetics came along that I can't imagine doing it, but some people did it. So there were some things that could be done, but by and large, no. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1860s that going to the doctor correlated with living a little longer. So why did they go? They went to know, why am I sick? Or am I sick? Am I going to get better? They went for prognosis. And if you see patients all the while, you learn this that way. And frequently, it's not bottom up, it's top down. As one of my friends in South Africa said, we had a mutual friend that said, oh, I love that man. He's now dead. A good friend. And she said, the first time I heard him teach at Grand Rounds, I was doing pediatrics, he's a pediatrician. And afterwards I went and said, Prof. Hanson, will you come and look at a patient for me? And John Hanson, lovely man, he would do that sort of thing. He went and taught and ran clinics in Soweto in the middle of apartheid and the like. But anyway, she took him along and he told her the story of this little child. And she said, I don't know what's going on. So he got belly pain. And he put his hand on the child's abdomen and he smiled. He said, he's got tuberculosis. And she said, how do you know that? He said, oh, I felt it many times before. He was right. That you can't do medicine seriously interacting with patients without learning a lot of things. And we all have different talents. So in any given city, doctors are not widgets. You ask any group of physicians, who's the best surgeon, who's the best internist, you don't get a random scattering of names. The same names come up. In any hospital, we all know who's a humdrum, not the greatest physician, but reasonably competent. But we all know who the people are who are an order of magnitude better. I had the privilege of working for several such, and that is an incredible experience to have. I was blessed by a young man whose name I have forgotten, but I hope he's done well in his life. But he was just one step further up the rung than me when I became the junior resident. We used to work in groups, the boss, the consultant, the senior registrar had been around about 10 years after graduation. And if it's a big firm, then an ordinary registrar a few years, who was immediately above me. I was just out of medical school, and within a week or two, we were, I can't remember the exact situation, but I remember what he said to me, and he was absolutely right. He said, the bedside is no place for intellectual pride. My besetting sin. He nailed it. Never forgot it. It was a wonderful thing to have been taught at that moment. I think I am going to stop at that point because the next bit takes a long. Well, I'll tell you what next week's lecture will be. These are the things that I think we've got to really seriously think about putting education back in the church, where it came from in the first place. What we didn't do with Augustine College was have a church base. At the same time, in Moscow, Idaho, New St. Andrews was being started, but they wisely started from not a church, but a network of churches that are already schooling children. So they've got several thousand students in a college, which is a wonderful place to go, New St. Andrews. We look as though we might fold. I hope not, but we'll see. And here is the list of the non-negotiables in education that I think, if these are not present in a significant number of people, the system will fail. I put first on the list the need for transcendence, God. Second on the list, that it's our God. People who say, this is what happened to me. Thirdly, truth is above your feelings. There is such a thing as objective truth. We don't pretend we've always got there, but that's what we're searching for. And fourth, they must learn that without morality we cannot flourish. The Jews know that. If you will keep this law, it will go well with you and your children forever. They must understand the image of God in them, the fundamental requirement of transcendence for justice and law. Therefore, they must understand that we're all fallen creatures. They must understand the 9 questions that everyone has asked since the beginning of time, because without answers to those questions, you'll always be in something of a mess. They must understand that the process that reductionism led to relativism, led to inappropriate tolerance and multiculturalism and all the rest. They must be able to understand the difference between feelings and thought, and therefore the nature of logic. Sex as biology, the family as male and female, because we are different and complementary. Race as unimportant, culture very important. The way to deal with race is not talk about it, simply insist on talking about culture. That's what Denzel Washington does, what Tom Sowell does. It's the way to go. We need to learn to live with the tragic vision instead of the arrogant anointedness of those who rule us at the moment. Bottom line, here we have no abiding city, but we seek a city whose builder and maker is God. I hope you have a wonderful week.